Hello ladies and gentlemen, WillE here. Raiding. If there has been one aspect of World of Warcraft that has constantly kept it above water over the years, it's been raiding. Through the thick and the thin, drama and criticism, it's been one of those areas of Azeroth players current and past can look at and say, yeah, that's actually pretty good. From the humble beginnings of these open caverns filled with giants and elementals where players and developers stumbled their way through resistance-based encounters and trying to make something work for up to 40 people, all the way to today where we have esport teams, huge sponsor-led events, coaches, analysts and 20 incredible players performing the utter peak of WoW PvE content, all for us live to enjoy as each new tier opens up on Mythic. And raiding has undergone many changes to get where it is today. In fact, it must be one of the, if not the most iterated upon gameplay systems we still have. From day one of vanilla all the way up to today in Shadowlands, there has always been, and always will be, raiding. But it wasn't always so simple as vanilla or as complicated as a mythic raid in Shadowlands. There was a lot of stuff in between, testing ideas, trial and error, scaling that balance of challenge for the hardcore players whilst creating an entry point for the more casual WoW fans. And a lot of that took place during Wrath of the Lich King, our next step for Classic. Wrath was the only expansion ever where raiding changed in some way every single tier. It certainly didn't stop it being incredibly successful back then, but I wonder the second time around whether everything will be kept as it was in the order that it went. See, it might all be a little bit confusing because we start off with 10 and 25 man raids, they drop different gear and tokens, and of course they don't share a lockout, but then things change to include hard modes which also drop different gear and are activated in random ways before the fights inside their instance. And we have a secret end boss which despawns after an hour as well, and there are special server first achievements, but then after that we throw everything we just worked on in the bin and add 10 and 25 man normals and heroics instead that you need to toggle outside of the instance, but the heroic raids get a set number of attempts per week until the instance auto locks out. And then there's also even more insane achievements, but the normals and heroics don't share a lockout here, so you can run the same raid 4 times per week. Later on they do share a lockout, and we also keep attempts, but only for the end bosses, and we're also going to release them in a staggered way week after week so you can't clear it all too fast. And then at the end there's Ruby Sanctum, which is actually kind of normal, and then they change stuff again in Kata, but only a little bit. You get all of that then? So yeah, raids are a bit of a mess. Not the raids themselves per se, but Wrath of the Lich King raiding is just all over the place format wise from one tier to the next. I want to break it down a bit more than that. Exactly which bits changed in Wrath of the Lich King, when, and most importantly why. Why did raiding need to change 4 times in the space of one expansion? Oh, but before we go on, check this out. I was looking at my YouTube analytics the other day and I couldn't believe it. One person who watches my videos isn't currently subscribed. How mad is that? So if you subscribe today, you can make that 100%. What an opportunity. Anyway, throughout this video, I'll be quoting from a blue post made by our boy Ian Hazard-Costas in 2014. He joined Blizzard in summer 2008, by the way, before Wrath of the Lich King launched. And at the time, his job description was game designer, and his responsibilities included raid boss design and implementation, class design and balancing, and maintaining the World of Warcraft achievement system. So in other words, he would have had a pretty big say in all of the Wrath of the Lich King raiding changes, so it should be some good insight from him. So when Wrath eventually dropped on the 13th of November 2008, there were those who have been ploughing their way through the Sunwell for the past 8 months or so, stacked to the brim with tons of gear, weapons and trinkets, and Sunwell, much like vanilla Naxxramas, had not been seen through by the majority of players. The peak of Burning Crusade raiding was another sheer wall of difficulty at the time, scaled by few, and so Tier 7 began. A revamped Naxxramas made sense to do it all again, all those perfectly good assets that barely anybody's seen beyond a faint whisper of legend in vanilla, the Eye of Eternity defeating a maddened dragon aspect in a single boss instance, and the Obsidian Sanctum, aka Sartharian's Lair, a point of meeting for the Black Dragon Flight. A strong 3-raid opening for the tier, you would think. Plenty to do there surely. Well, actually, no, not really. I can tell you that every single bit of raid content was cleared on the same day. Do you want to guess how many days from launch it took raiders back then to clear everything? Okay, well, I'm not going to give you too long to guess because it didn't take them that long to do either. The entirety of Tier 7 fell over in 2 days from launch, from logging in to clear. 2 days. And that wasn't just the top guilds either, so many others would follow in the days to come. The content was simply not very well tuned for the level of power that players had access to, not just from TBC gaming either. The questing blues and BOEs from Wrath of the Lich King were also very powerful. Also, it's worth a mention, revamped Naxx is just easier. Naxx, a lot of these hardcore players had already done it one time, so a trip back there was nothing really to learn mechanically. Also, Death Knights at this point in time were mega, giga, ultra broken, overpowered. As for the other raids, half the Malagos fight is on a vehicle, and Sartharian Zero Drakes just isn't much of a boss fight, to be honest. Also, we can hardly miss this bit out. Wrath of the Lich King changed the number of people you raid with. It's no longer one difficulty, one raid side. Raids were split into either 10 or 25 man on separate lockouts, of course. 10 more casual friendly, designed to get those who saw raids as big scary obstacles in there to give them a try with their friends or families. 25 was meant to be harder and have better separate loot tables, but on this first pass for the difficulty, it missed the mark. Whilst 10-man content got many new people into raids, those who pushed for performance were left without a real challenge. This is where another feature of Wrath of the Lich King was due to bridge the gap where challenge lacked. Achievements. These offered their own incentives through mounts and titles to try and complete raiding content under certain conditions. Kill a boss with less players than usual, or tried a really fast kill. Some were held in high regard at the start of Wrath of the Lich King. Undying has always stood out to me as really cool, which was Naxx in Wrath with 0 deaths, and Sartharian 3 Drakes upped the difficulty of the encounter considerably and rewarded both a title and a mount for the victors. Blizzard's concept here was, all players get to see the Obsidian Sanctum and experience the fight, but players looking for an extra challenge can take on a tougher version of the same encounter and will be rewarded accordingly. The idea of having an encounter where players can choose to modify the difficulty during the raid instance had really been born here. Okay, technically 3 bugs and AQ40 was the first because the loot and difficulty depended on kill order, but they didn't really do anything with the idea for years, because the next tier of raiding would take the player-driven difficulty modifications and build it into the majority of the encounters. This was Tier 8, Patch 3.1, and Ulduar, an ancient Titan facility carved into one of the most breathtaking zones Blizzard has ever put together, and the home to an equally ancient evil. A tier where 9 out of the 13 encounters had an optional mode that awarded superior loot if completed. This was Hard mode. Different from Heroic in that Heroic is a choice you make on your UI before entering the instance. Hard mode, however, was a boss by boss choice that you make where it was possible, and just as well, some of them were much harder than others. This gave raiders the choice. Do you have a good setup to try this hard mode? Are there newer players or alts with you today? How much time do you have left this reset? One raid containing the baseline fights that everybody had the chance to see, with the option to toggle a harder version for better loot and more challenge. And to top it off, a secret hard mode end boss, Algalon the Observer. Though in Wrath of the Lich King Classic, we may not be hearing
"Citizens of Dalaran, raise your eyes to the skies and observe"
quite as much as you used to in retail. Who am I kidding? It's going to be spammed on the mega servers, isn't it? We're going to have to turn off voiceover. It's going to be that common. Make that cross-layer, why don't you, Blizz? So then, hard modes are a thing. Problem solved. That's it for the Wrath of the Lich King changes then. Well, as you probably know, no, it's not. Far from it, in fact. Because the next circular room, raid, would change things again. Tier 9, Patch 3.2. Back to a more divisive raid after the triumph of Ulduar. Get used to the look of the walls and that crowd. In 3 months' time, you'll probably be able to tell me how many people are sitting in each stand. This is Trial of the Crusader. A very cool idea. A big old tournament to find Azeroth's most hardened heroes to storm the gates of Icecrown Citadel and defeat the Lich King and his boys once and for all. But things changed again. Hard mode was now a thing of the past, replaced by a toggle outside of the instance. In the same way dungeons have been since the Burning Crusade, this was Heroic mode. Blizzard envisioned this as We had 3 distinct levels of raid difficulty: normal, 10-man player; hard, 10-man player heroic or 25-man player normal; and very hard, 25-man player heroic. Yes, 25-man and 10-man heroic were meant to be similar levels of challenge here. So, hard modes then, they seemed good. What was the problem with them? Why did they have to go? Well, here's what Ian had to say about that. While many players had and continue to hold a fondness for organic hard modes that could be enabled by specified actions within an encounter, they were inconsistent and often lacking clarity. Some of them, the Assembly of Iron or Freya, were elegant and intuitive, but others were frustrating or created traps for players. Whoops, you killed Hodir in 121 seconds, try again next week. Or stop DPS, don't kill XT's heart. Others were too obscure and unlikely to be discovered without reading a guide. See General Vezax. Also, he goes on to say there are long-term concerns over the number of directions that hard modes could be implemented into encounters. Wrath of the Lich King had already used the same idea twice: Starfarian 3 Drakes, Freya 3 Keepers, and the big red button is very cool and all, but the novelty of it is how unique it is. Heroic mode is like a big red button itself, but you just press it outside of the instance under your character frame, which isn't exactly the same, is it? So, trial of the Crusader launch with 10-man, 10-man heroic, 25-man, and 25-man heroic. And when the day comes and that Colosseum opens without changes, it will be optimal for you to clear it 4 times per week. For badges if nothing else. Attempts were also added to try and stop players bashing their head against the walls of end bosses. Heroic was considered a mastery of mechanics, not a 500 plus pulled brute force slaughterfest, and this wouldn't be the last raid to see this mechanic either. Trial of the Grand Crusader, the heroic version for 10 and 25, had 50 attempts, or wipes maximum per week, after which the remaining bosses would despawn and come back next reset. There were even achievements based upon having 0 wipes in heroic mode, which were limited time when the raid was current and to this day are extremely rare due to the very high challenge of doing that. In fact, when taking a look on Wowhead, 1% of profiles had this. Oh, and there's also this, a tribute to immortality, complete trial of the Grand Crusader 25-man with 0 deaths. This award's amount, attained by so few people, it shows that 0% of people have it on Wowhead. I think I can say there will be a handful of guilds with this in the world in Wrath of the Lich King Classic. Whilst you might be hearing Raise Your Eyes to the Sky a lot, I think this one will be much rarer. So the move from hard mode to heroic may have turned raiding into more of a repetitive grind than was intended, but Blizzard were overall happy with the direction that it was going, and they said ultimately organized raiding feels most satisfying when players encounter a challenge, they strategize, adapt, and practice their execution, and then are able to overcome that challenge. Also, they mention it may be of interest to note that at the time we very nearly did not include a 10-player heroic difficulty at all. There was limited evidence that many players other than 25-player raiders were actually doing 10-player Ulduar hard modes, but due to having exactly 1 raid tier to ascertain whether or not there was a demand for it, they erred on the side of caution and decided to keep it, and I'm glad they did. I had a lot of fun in the 10-man heroics during Kata. But for Wrath of the Lich King, we have 1 major tier left. Patch 3.3 Tier 10 Icecrown Citadel, the final tier, the big culmination, and even more changes to raiding, though nothing quite as severe as what we've seen so far. Ian said, "We realised that we needed to do something about the one major drawback of the trial of the Crusader structure. Players were routinely clearing the content up to 4 times a week on the same character for Emblems of Triumph, if nothing else. Whilst Trial of the Crusader was a 5-man raid and wasn't totally unreasonable to do that many times per reset, Icecrown Citadel was a 12-boss marathon of a raid and would have severely sapped the player base. So along came changes to the lockout system, with them saying, allow players to switch dynamically between the 2 difficulties mid-raid. But then Blizzard decided, you know what, this is too simple, we need to do something weird with raiding again to keep it fresh. So they staggered the normal releases, the heroic releases, and then they added attempts on top of it. Whilst patch 3.3 dropped on 9th of December 2009, the end of each wing within the raid didn't become available till some time later. The Plague Wing became available on January 5th, where you had 10 attempts, The Bloodwing became available on January 19th, where the attempts have been up to 15, and the Frostwing on February 2nd, including the Lich King with 20 attempts total. And those 20 attempts were shared between all of the 4 end bosses: Putricide, Lanathel, Sindragosa, and Lich King. Attempts would then be removed from normal mode 2 weeks later, but the heroic mode dropped on the same week that the Frostwing did on normal. But the end bosses also kept the attempt system in for a very long time and then gradually gained 5 more attempts every 2 weeks. This is partially why heroic Lich King lived for over 40 days. It was also just a really hard encounter, and what a legendary kill video that Paragon ended putting together of it. Other changes included a raid-wide debuff called Chill of the Throne because tank scaling was getting kind of wonky again by the end of the expansion. You will see something exactly like this in the Sunwell, because otherwise druids would be full-on role-playing Neo from the Matrix on boss encounters. A scaling buff was introduced 4 months after the launch of ICC to help people clear, and by July 2010 your entire raid was 30% stronger through this buff, though you could turn it off if you wanted to. This was designed to help people just get clears and be able to see the instance through eventually. Oh, and I nearly forgot, there's actually 2 more raids on top of this in Wrath of the Lich King. There is a revamped Onyxia, which was released after Trial of the Crusader but before Icecrown Citadel. This wasn't really meant to be a challenge, it was just a celebration anniversary event for the game. You go there, laugh at funny DKP minus memes, and get some revamped loot. There was also the Vault of Archivon, which was in Wintergrasp. You'd be able to access this following your faction winning the battle and holding the zone. This was a really simple raid, it was always pugged back in the day. There'd be a number of Warden bosses in there which would drop tier tokens appropriate for the current tier as well as PvP gear. Each new tier that opened, there'd be a new Warden added and they'd drop additional appropriate gear. And then finally patch 3.3.5, Ruby Sanctum, which had some absolutely insane loot but no other changes. Toggle heroic on or off, go kill some dragons. Woohoo, very cool. That's Wrath of the Lich King raiding then. Looking forwards to it, but it makes you wonder. Blizzard have historically really liked leaving everything on the last patch for Classic because it's easier to understand than having patch by patch changes. It is the final version and it will reflect the best and, even as they have said, the most complete version of the game as it was back then. It's a question, and a big one, to put to Blizzard. Are you going to leave it in what retrospectively became known as learning points during the expansion, or are we going to have a bit of a different experience the second time around? Oh, and before that, they won't change anything comments. Both copying Wrath of the Lich King schedule involves changing something every single patch, and changing something also involves changing something. So it's just a question of which one will work better. Personally, I reckon they're going to put shared lockouts into Trial of the Crusader and not change anything else from how it was at the time. Maybe even that is too far though, and we're all desperate for that real 4 clears a week just to appreciate that raid and how good it was. That's about everything though. Let me know your thoughts on what you think they will do, if anything. And as always, thank you all so much for watching and listening in, and I shall see you all in the next one very soon.